Right now, somewhere in central China, there is a city built almost entirely around one product. At its busiest, more than 250,000 people live and work there. It can turn out 500,000 phones in a single day. That's almost one every 100th of a second. Workers call it iPhone City. And in 2025, 4 years after the world first heard stories about underpaid, overworked staff building the world's most expensive phones, a new report came out. It said many of those same problems were still happening. Wages held back, illegal hours, teenagers pulled into night shifts under the cover of school programs. Apple is the richest company on the planet. So how does this keep happening, right under its nose, year after year? Let's go inside. Here's the first thing most people get wrong. Apple doesn't actually own the factories that build its phones. Apple designs the iPhone. Apple sells the iPhone. But Apple does not build the iPhone. That job belongs to a company called Foxconn. Foxconn's full name is Hon Hai Precision Industry. It's a Taiwanese company, and it is enormous. At one point, it employed over 1 million people, just in China. It builds electronics for all kinds of brands: Dell, HP, Samsung. But its most famous customer, by far, is Apple. Foxconn was started by a businessman named Terry Gou. He's known for being outspoken and a little larger than life, the kind of guy people compare to Donald Trump. He built Foxconn from almost nothing into one of the largest employers on Earth, and the single biggest Foxconn site of them all sits on the edge of a city called Zhengzhou. Zhengzhou is a city of around 10 million people. It's in Henan province, an area that used to be one of the poorer parts of China. That matters, because it explains why so many people are willing to travel there for factory work in the first place. The Foxconn plant there is so big, locals just call it iPhone City, and the nickname fits. At peak times, this one site can have 200,000 people or more working inside it. That's more people than live in most Western cities. Around the factory gates, entire neighborhoods have sprung up just to serve the workers: cheap restaurants, foot massage shops, phone repair stalls, dorms. During the busiest months, right before a new iPhone launches, this single factory can crank out roughly 500,000 phones a day. Do the math, and that works out to almost 350 phones every single minute of every single day. Inside, the work is broken into hundreds of tiny steps. Around 400 separate tasks make up the final assembly of an iPhone. Most workers get assigned to just one of them. Maybe you solder a chip, maybe your entire job, all day, every day, is fitting one single screw into the back of a phone. Over and over. Thousands of times a shift. A few years back, a student from NYU named Dijian Zheng wanted to know what really happens on that factory floor. So he did something simple. He got in line. He just showed up outside the gates like any other job seeker. They checked his ID, they asked him to say the English alphabet, since English shows up a lot on the equipment. That was basically it. He was hired. Zheng spent months working the line alongside around 200 other new hires, building phones for shift after shift. His main takeaway wasn't that it was brutal or violent. It was that it was mind-numbingly repetitive. He said the work itself was boring more than anything. 6-day weeks. A supervisor yelling now and then to keep the line moving. And officially, overtime was voluntary. Unofficially, everyone understood that saying no to overtime could get you fired. This isn't just something that happens on its own. Local government helps keep the pipeline of workers flowing. During the busy season, recruiters are known to stand right outside the factory gates, calling out for workers. Some reports say towns and villages in the province are even given unofficial quotas, basically targets for how many local workers they're expected to send to the factory to keep it running. Most workers are young, somewhere between 18 and 25, but that number isn't a hard line. Interns as young as 16 have shown up in the mix. And this is the part that got Apple in real trouble. Investigators have found underage workers, in some cases kids as young as 14 or 15, inside factories connected to Apple's supply chain. Not always at the giant Zhengzhou site itself, but close enough in the chain that Apple couldn't say it had no idea. Workers usually live right on site, in big dorm buildings, sometimes 10 or 12 floors tall. 8 people might share a single room. On some floors, 200 people share just a handful of bathrooms. A group called China Labor Watch has gone undercover multiple times to check on conditions there. What they found wasn't always the worst-case horror story you might expect. But it also wasn't good. During the busiest stretches of the year, workers have been told they simply aren't allowed to quit. Not fired if they underperform, actually blocked from resigning until the rush is over. One worker, whose whole job was wiping polish onto phone screens, said she handled around 1,700 phones a day. Her honest take wasn't that it was torture, it was that it was mind-numbing, boring, more than painful. And that boredom is actually the single most common complaint from people who've worked there. Not danger, not cruelty, just the sheer grinding sameness of doing the same tiny motion thousands of times a day, 6 days a week, only really seeing your family if they happen to already live nearby. It's not hard to see why so many workers quit after a year or so. People get tired, people get bored. And then they leave, and Foxconn has to go find more. For years, Apple's line has basically been, "We take this seriously, we audit our suppliers, we hold everyone to a high standard." Then, in September of 2025, a new investigation dropped. And it should have been embarrassing. China Labor Watch spent 6 months, from March through September, digging into the exact same Zhengzhou factory, right as it was racing to build the new iPhone 17. What they found wasn't some brand new scandal. It was the same old problems, in some cases worse than before. Over half the workforce they found were what's called dispatch workers. That basically means temporary staff, hired through outside agencies instead of directly by Foxconn. Chinese law says dispatch workers should never make up more than about 10% of a company's staff. At this factory, they made up more than half. Why does that matter? Because dispatch workers have way less protection. The report found many of them were paid as little as 25 yuan an hour, only a few dollars, and their pay was split into 2 parts, with the second half held back until the following month. If a worker quit early, before that second payment came through, they could lose weeks of pay they'd already earned. Investigators also found workers logging 60 to 75 hours a week. That's well above what Chinese law allows. It's also above the 60-hour cap that Apple itself claims to enforce across its supply chain. Maybe the most uncomfortable detail in the whole report is this. Investigators say Apple's own employees were physically present at the factory while all of this was happening. Which raises an obvious question. If Apple staff were on the ground, how did Apple not know? The 2025 report also raised something that sounds almost unbelievable if you didn't already know China's factory system. Some of the workers on that line weren't full employees at all. They were students, sent in through school-linked internship programs, sometimes tied to whether they'd be allowed to graduate. These student workers were reportedly paid even less than everyone else, sometimes around 12 yuan an hour. And despite officially being students, they were pushed onto night shifts and forced overtime just like regular staff. The report also pointed to hiring discrimination. Investigators said the factory's hiring system effectively filtered out applicants from certain ethnic minority groups, including Uyghurs, even without any official policy saying so out loud. Apply through the system as a member of one of those groups, and your application would quietly get rejected. Foxconn's public response was that it's an equal opportunity employer and doesn't tolerate discrimination. It also pointed to outside audits it says it has gone through. But the group that runs those audits reportedly didn't even respond when China Labor Watch asked for details on how transparent that process really was. Apple's response, when the report came out, was that its teams were already on site and had opened an investigation, and that it holds its suppliers to strict standards around labor and human rights. Beyond wages and hours, there's a heavier layer to this story, one that isn't really about Zhengzhou specifically, but still connects back to Apple. Reporting from the New York Times and others has linked parts of Apple's wider supply chain to forced labor involving Uyghurs, an ethnic minority group in China that has faced well-documented mistreatment, including forced labor, and in some cases, having their wages stolen outright by the people overseeing them. When lawmakers in the US tried to pass legislation aimed at cracking down on forced labor tied to this group, reports emerged suggesting Apple pushed back against parts of that bill behind the scenes. Apple has denied lobbying against the legislation directly, saying instead that it simply had what it called constructive conversations with congressional staff. Make of that phrasing what you will. And this pattern of knowing about a problem and not fully fixing it isn't new. Years earlier, a different Apple supplier, a firm called Suyin Electronics, was caught employing workers as young as 14. Apple's response at the time was to tell Suyin to fix it or risk losing the contract. But according to people who used to work on Apple's own supplier responsibility team, Apple kept doing business with Suyin for roughly 3 more years after that. Former staff have said, bluntly, that profit tends to be the thing that actually drives these decisions, whatever the public statements say. To be fair, not everything in the 2025 report was bad news. Investigators didn't find any underage workers this time around, unlike an earlier investigation back in 2019, which had found some workers who were still technically in vocational school and underage. Total overtime hours had also come down somewhat compared to a few years ago, even though they were still well above the legal limit. So there has been some improvement, just not nearly enough to call the problem solved. Apple has also started shifting some production out of China entirely, partly because of labor concerns, and partly, honestly, because of tariffs and trade tensions between the US and China. A growing share of iPhones sold in America are now actually being built in India instead. Whether that ends up meaning better conditions for workers, or whether the exact same pressures just show up in a new country under a new flag, is still an open question. So here's the real question. Apple is worth trillions of dollars. It could, in theory, absorb higher labor costs without even noticing. So why do these same stories keep resurfacing year after year, report after report? Part of the answer is speed. Every year, Apple needs to launch a new iPhone by a fixed date, in huge numbers all at once. That means a few frantic months of insane demand, followed by quieter stretches the rest of the year. Keeping a permanent workforce big enough for peak season, then paying them all year round during the slow months, would cost a fortune. So instead, factories lean hard on temporary dispatch workers who can be brought in fast for the rush and let go just as fast once it's over. It's efficient. It's also exactly the kind of setup that makes workers easy to underpay and hard to protect. Part of the answer is distance. Apple doesn't run these factories itself. Foxconn does. That gives Apple a convenient layer of separation. When something goes wrong, Apple can say, correctly, that it wasn't technically their factory, their managers, or their decision. It's a real legal distinction. Whether it's a meaningful moral one is a different question entirely, especially when reports say Apple's own staff were standing right there while it was happening. And part of the answer is just leverage. Foxconn depends enormously on Apple's business. Apple could, if it wanted to, walk away from a supplier that keeps breaking the rules. It's chosen, again and again, not to. There's one more twist worth mentioning, and it might end up mattering more than any audit or new law. Back during his undercover stint, that NYU student noticed something. Some of the stations on his line had already been replaced by robots, machines the workers nicknamed Foxbots. That was years ago. The trend hasn't slowed down since. Foxconn has kept investing heavily in automation, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. The debate over wages, overtime, and dispatch workers might eventually become beside the point, not because anyone fixed it, but because there simply won't be as many humans left on the line to exploit in the first place. That's not obviously a happy ending either. It's just a different kind of ending, and one that hundreds of thousands of workers in Zhengzhou probably aren't thinking about as they clock in for another 12-hour shift. Every year, Apple puts out a slick keynote, new iPhone, new camera, new chip, sleek stage, perfect lighting, calm, confident voice telling you why this is the best one yet. What that keynote never mentions is Zhengzhou. It never mentions the dispatch workers earning a few dollars an hour, the split paychecks designed to stop people from quitting, or the 16-year-olds who've turned up on factory floors connected to the world's most valuable company. Apple didn't build iPhone City, but it built the demand that made iPhone City necessary. And every single year, for one brand new phone, hundreds of thousands of people still show up at those gates, say the alphabet in English, and get to work.